we're really lucky to have Amanda Barnes with us today. How did I find you, Amanda? I think I was on some Oxford Zoom when I spotted Amanda talking to the Latin America Centre about wines of Latin America, and I thought, here's someone who really knows what they're talking about, and got in touch. Amanda started her journalistic life as a junior reporter on the Alton Post Gazette, I hear, in 2007. But since 2009, I think, she'll correct me if I'm wrong, when she moved to Argentina, and I can think of a lot worse places to move, she's been heavily involved with writing about Latin American wines. And I think there's probably no one in this country, at least, with more knowledge than she has. She writes for international magazines, Decanter. She's been a critic and a panel taster for many international wine competitions, which must be a real tough challenge. She's also has a project called Around the World in 80 Harvests, which look really fascinating. And now, of course, her latest and greatest work is her South American wine guide, which I must say I want, one of the first ones off the press. It looks amazing, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it in a minute. But Amanda will talk to us and then take some questions. Please pop them in the chat as we go along. I've got some that you sent me earlier by the email, so I've got those up my sleeve. And she'll also explain to us how we can give a little bit of feedback on whatever wine we happen to be drinking. So Amanda, if you'd like to unmute yourself, and welcome.
So thank you for the introduction, and you're right, 2009 is when I moved to Argentina and moved to Mendoza in order to learn about wine from the vineyards up, and really got this great experience from the winemakers, viticulturalists there, who took me under their wing and walked me through the vineyards and taught me everything through the winemaking process and viticulture as well, which is half the task of winemaking is what happens in the vineyard. And then in about 2011, I started working a lot in Chile. I started writing for Wines of Chile and going practically on a monthly voyage. And I'm sure many of you have done a beautiful trip across the Andes, whether by road or air. And so started focusing on both Argentina, have kind of since expanded to write about Uruguay and Brazil vines. So my kind of experience has really been, the project has really focused on making this book. So for the last 10 years, I've been researching in many ways. So we'll move on and start talking a bit. I wanted to give you a kind of overview a little bit about the history of wines. I know many of you have been to South America and very kind of aware of the destinations there. So I'm going to try and focus much more on the wine side. So I think one thing that we often forget about South America is that it really is the first new world of wine, the Americas, much earlier planted than South Africa or Australia, which we often kind of think of as meccas of New World wine. But the first vines came on Christopher Columbus's second voyage in 1493 and landed there on the Caribbean and kind of proliferated from there, both upwards towards the US and through Mexico, which was much more important at the time for wine production, and then down through South America as well. And the first kind of main wine region or production center that emerged in South America was in Peru, obviously being the kind of viceroyalty and the area that they most wanted to conquer and control, and wine was one of the ways to do that. And so that really emerged as the main wine region for that large part of the 16th century and 17th. And then the crown got a little bit jealous of the wine production in Peru, and so it got very much hampered. And actually the talk on this touched on it last month as well, about Bolivia, which also kind of emerged wine production region, relatively big. I should put inverted commas around that, as an important wine region in the 16th and 17th century. countries for the had a large population of both wealthy and poor, and all of whom wanted to be drinking to kind of get rid of the bad memory of the mines and the experience of living there. Chile and Argentina were kind of next to come across, and Chile, really the wine regions emerged around the main ports. So you actually had quite separated wine regions from the kind of top of the Central Valley, or up to Arica, up to the borders of Peru. You had wine production all the way down to Concepcion, which is kind of the heart of Maule and Etata today. And we still see that very kind of split dynamic in Chile. You still have these vineyards all over the country, which is part of the reason I decided to stay in Mendoza, because most of the wine production is concentrated there in Argentina, in Mendoza, whereas in Chile, you're constantly traveling in order to visit all the vineyards. Argentina, we had different entry points for wine in Argentina, interestingly enough. Some kind of the first recorded production was in Santiago del Estero. I can pull up the map in a moment. But there were also entry points from the port of Buenos Aires and down from Bolivia. So it really kind of started everywhere, but where it really took was along the Andes, and we'll touch on that very shortly. Brazil did have an early start in the 1550s with the Portuguese. However, in the tropical and very humid climate, where they were first planting in Sao Paulo, it just didn't take root, and it was quite a difficult place to make wine. So they did make some wine in the 1560s, I believe. However, it kind of had a false start and stopped there. And it wasn't until the 1800s when Brazil and Uruguay really came onto the scene as wine producers today. So those are still our main wine producing countries, but the biggest in plantations and also production, although it vies with Chile occasionally, is Argentina. And this is a map from my book, and I hope it's big enough on your screen, but I'll send you the PDFs if you'd like to zoom in on it later. But as you can see, most of the wine regions are very much on this Andean corridor. And up to Jujuy, which is a historic wine region, but also a re-emerging wine region, and one that's small in plantation, but certainly kind of got a very interesting quality. Salta, Tucumán, and Catamarca, which between them share the Calchaquí valleys, which is what we're going to look at for our first wine. And then La Rioja has an important wine production too. San Juan is the second biggest province in terms of wine production. And Mendoza is the big daddy. It's the mecca. Over 70% of Argentina's wine production, and between it and San Juan, it accounts for more than 85, and actually probably a bit more than that. I don't have the figures to hand. They are in book though. Cordoba was a historic wine region, and there were plantings in Cordoba, and there's a kind of re-emerging renaissance of wine there. And then another one of the historic wine regions was Rio Negro, which is one of those green markings towards the bottom. And then I'll talk at the very end about the new wine regions emerging, which are all kind of beyond there. But you can see that very much wine production was all concentrated across the Andean corridor. And there's a very good reason for that. Argentina, as you all know, is a very dry climate. And vineyards need around 800 millimeters of water a year in order to produce fruit and survive. And in Argentina, in Mendoza, we have barely 250, depending on the year, sometimes much less, sometimes a bit more. But it's not enough to make wine in a dry farming method as you do in France or large parts of Spain and Italy. So the important reason that we have viticulture here along the Andes is that we have the ability to irrigate, and these irrigation channels, which are called acequias, were built by the native Huarpe Indians, so pre-existed the arrival of the Spanish. So from the 1500s, when they first kind of moved into the areas of Argentina, they discovered that Mendoza already had a system of acequias. And that was something that was made by the Huarpes and really kind of driven also by the Inca influence as well. And so they already had this network of irrigation channels for grains and other crops that they were growing, which made it ideal as a place to start with viticulture. So that's why it really thrived, was this ready access for water. And back then there was plenty of snow and rivers that were able to give adequate water to really allow the area to grow as a viticulture region. The other reason that these Andean wine regions really thrived was because we have a mountain and a continental climate, meaning that we have incredibly hot, sunny, dry days, but very cool nights. And that's really important for quality wine production. So even though that makes it easier to produce wine, it's also, you know, this stress that the vine has of kind of changing temperature is actually what kind of enables it to concentrate its energy and produce much more concentrated and quality focused wines. The cold weather is also, the cold nights is also really important for the retention of acidity and for the kind of concentration of flavors and colors, whereas we need the sunshine in order to accumulate sugars and develop certain flavors. So all of these climate factors really impact, and we can touch on that a bit when we get to some of the high altitude wine regions too, because it also changes there. The other really important factor of the Andes is that it creates a rain shadow. So even though I said that vines do like a lot of rain or water to survive, if you have too much, then you have obviously problems of mildew and rot setting in, and that makes it quite challenging. And especially in those early days where there wasn't as much knowledge about how to manage those, you know, challenges, you know, having a dry climate with irrigation and water access was a real benefit, and made it quite easy to grow grapes in large quantities and of quite good quality. And then the other important thing here is the soils. Soil is incredibly important for the production of good quality grapes. It's kind of the opposite to most crops, whereas with most crops you're looking for very fertile soil, and you're looking for something that's going to give you really good productivity. To get quality wine, you're actually looking for balanced but also slightly poorer soils, because again, you want to stress the vine. If you leave a grapevine to grow by itself, it will grow. I mean, you've probably seen ones growing around trees, and last month we saw some of the incredible vines of Bolivia, which are absolutely beautiful to see. But if they allow themselves to kind of grow in their own environment, then they will grow into enormous huge vine systems, and they will produce very little good quality grapes, but a lot of kind of small green grapes which would be far too bitter to make any wine. So that's the kind of key to the success of Argentina's early viticulture, and why it became one of the biggest wine producing regions in the world as early as the 18th century. There were many heydays of Argentina, and I won't go into it, but at one stage in the 1800s, it did have the largest winery in the world. And still there's no winery yet that we know is any bigger than that. And there's some rather interesting stories of the way that they used to actually transport the wine. It was so much from this hiolo, and they would actually just pipe it straight onto the trains that would take it and directly to Buenos Aires. And actually, when you speak to some locals, because this carried on through some of the early 1900s as well, when they speak to some of the locals, they have anecdotes of how their grandfather or father used to tap the pipe and they used to steal wine from it. So there was, you know, Argentina has been a machine of production for a really long time. But today we're also, you know, really focused on great quality. So I wanted to introduce, so in terms of wine, there are several really important things. Climate, everything going on above the vine in terms of, you know, your weather, your temperatures, the water that you're receiving, the sunshine, everything going below the vine in terms of the soil, the water distribution, the nutrients. And then you've also got the vine itself, so the grape variety. And you might have a different variety for the root stock, and you might have a different variety on top. But we won't go into that today because it's irrelevant for the wines that we're going to be talking about and tasting. But I think it is important to introduce the Criolla grape variety family tree, because these are only grape varieties that you find in South America. And as most of you, I'm sure, know from the term Criolla, it would typically be of someone of mixed Spanish and Native American descent and born in the Americas. And that's what it refers to when we talk about the Criolla grapes as well. This is a diagram from my book, and I've just noticed that I've given it to you with not with the right page numbers, so ignore see page 99. But basically this is the kind of some of the main varieties that we'll find in South America. And here, founding varieties at the bottom, the three at the very bottom, are part of those original vines that came with Christopher Columbus in the 15th century. So we've got Moscatel De Alexandria, which is one of the most widely spread varieties in the world and has given birth to lots of different muscat varieties. I'm sure everyone's tasted muscat at some point in some different version, whether it be something like Asti or a sweet kind of muscat from Rutherglen. But there's a huge family of muscat varieties, but one of the key ones that came to South America was Moscatel de Alexandria, a white grape. And then Listan Prieto was the other incredibly important one, which today you'll often find it Chile sold as piece. And it's in Argentina. You can still have Listan Prieto wines. They're called Criolla Chica. But in most of the Americas, it's known as Misionera. And in the US, it's known as the Mission grape. So you might have tried it there. And basically from these two varieties came most of the other varieties. There's also Moyarcano, but that was mainly in Peru and produced an important pisco grape. So some of these grape varieties are used for pisco and Singani and distilled into brandies, but some of them are used for wine. And the first one that we're going to look at is Torrontés. So Torrontés is a native Criolla grape. It was born in Argentina. Actually, it's three grapes, but it was born in Argentina. And most plantings, 99% of Torrontés, are still in Argentina. And it's an incredibly important grape variety for Argentina. There's just under 10,000 hectares in total of Torrontés. There's actually three varieties of Torrontés. They're all kind of siblings. There's San Juanino, Riojano, and Mendocino. Mendocino is not very common. The most important one is Riojano, which means from Rioja, obviously, which is where it was first discovered, but it's widely planted. And most Torrontés wines that you will drink will be from Torrontés Riojano. So I'd love everyone, if you've got your Torrontés and if you are tasting Torrontés, please feel free to kind of add it into the chat and let me know what you think or what you're trying, because I'd love to kind of get your opinions of it. I can't actually see the chat function, I think, because I'm sharing my screen. So maybe, Ed, if anyone's got any comments, you can just shout them out and, and communicate them. But Torrontés is a really interesting variety. I don't think it's like any other grape variety that you'll taste anywhere else or wine that you'll try elsewhere. There's the split of the three different varieties. This is quite a kind of technical explanation, but I think when you're tasting Torrontés, you really just need to have one whiff of the glass and you'll get this incredible kind of jasmine perfume and lychees and maybe orange blossom. It's a very attractive, pretty wine. And often when you smell it, you will think that it's a sweet wine because it smells so incredibly kind of floral and aromatic and sweet. But actually it's dry, and being the particular variety that it is, it can have this slight bitterness, which is quite typical for muscat varieties as well. The acidity tends to be quite low technically, but because most of the time it's made in a high altitude wine region, you get very fresh acidity. So the reason I very much kind of recommended trying a Torrontés from the north of Argentina is because this is where we get some incredible high altitude vineyards in the Calchaquí valleys. and that's great for the quality of Torrontés. So the Calchaquí Valley is between some mountain ranges and spread over the 3 different regions of Salta, Tucumán, and Catamarca. But most of the vineyards are found in Salta, which is what people will most likely know as well, and particularly Cafayate, which is a beautiful tourist destination, an incredible little village or town really to visit, which, you know, feels very much kind of in yesteryear and hasn't changed too much. And what's beautiful about this wine region is the really high altitude that we've got. So most vineyards are over 2,000 meters, and at this high altitude you get that freshness which retains in the evening a city, which is what can give it quite nice structure. This is interesting. So I can see the chat here. Someone's trying a Trapiche from 2010, which is incredibly old for Torrontés. So I'd be interested to know where you found that. Most people would drink their Torrontés within a couple years of vintage. So I'd say the most likely that you'll find in the market now is 2019, maybe some 2020s. And very soon, probably some 2021s. It's typically a wine which you don't want to keep for too long necessarily, because it doesn't really gain complexity in age. Instead, it tends to kind of lose those flamboyant floral aromas which make it so attractive. I think one of the things that's really interesting about how Torrontés has really flourished in the north and around Cafayate is because this is a region that actually suits white wines in terms of a gastronomy setting. And I think what's really interesting about wine, and one of the reasons that I fell in love with it, is that it's not just about what's in your glass, but it's about everything else around it. So, you know, we talk about geology, climate, history, but you also talk a lot about gastronomy, and especially wines that have been, you know, produced in a region for hundreds of years. It's gone hand in hand with the gastronomy and developed at the same time. And if you go to Cafayate, you'll find that even the meat empanadas, they're slightly spicier than they are elsewhere. And in the north, you get a lot more of that spice. You get a lot more of the lighter kind of corn dishes, which really go very nicely with Torrontés and with white wine. Whereas the further south we go, it's more kind of meat dominant, and that's why we're looking at much red wine production, one of the reasons, but I think it's a really important one. And so a lot of people, you know, will naturally think of meat empanadas and go with Malbec, but I would say if you've got a little bit of spice or some raisins and sweetness in that meat empanada, definitely have it with Torrontés. It's a great match. And another one that I really like having Torrontés with is more Asian cuisine, is that kind of, you know, those tropical kind of light sheep, sometimes you get some kind of mango notes, can go quite nicely with Asian cuisine and slightly more aromatic and interesting foods. And also because it's quite light, you don't need heavy dishes at all. In fact, it would suit lighter dishes much better. Super. So someone here is saying that they have a Santa Julia from Mendoza. Excellent. So I'm sorry that I don't know why they would have had it. Probably had been sitting there for a while in 2010. So I'd speak to the wine merchants about it. But I think we also get some really interesting Torrontéses now from Mendoza, and there have been some kind of new plantations in the higher areas of Mendoza, in the Yuca Valley in particular, which are doing really well. That is an important region for Torrontés production, and also San Juan. Okay, so we're going to move on to the big star of Argentina and move down to kind of the mecca of Argentine wine, so Malbec, and let's move to Mendoza. So I kind of like to describe the before and after, BC if you like and AC, but it would be the BM, before Malbec and after Malbec. But in 1853 is when Malbec was first brought, and any other international varieties were first brought to Argentina. So from the 1500s up until the mid 1850s, that's when we're only looking at these Criolla varieties. And then from then onwards, we start to see this introduction of international varieties, including Malbec, which was one of the very first, although they didn't know it was Malbec at the time. They just called it the Cepa Francesa. They had no idea what it was, but it grew very well, and so they kept it. Cabernet Sauvignon was one of these early ones to come, Chardonnay, and some really odd things, you know, Trousseau, which you still find these old vineyards kind of planted all over Argentina. But that's where the kind of big change started. And after that, we have lots of different trends that you see in Argentina. It's been a really important domestic producer and consumer of wine. So Argentina still consumes most of its wine, which is very different compared to the other wine regions of South America. Well, no, it's very different to Chile. So Malbec is one that really kind of thrived, and whereas in Bordeaux, which is where it was from, kind of Cahors, southwest France, and also was grown in Bordeaux, Malbec actually used to be one of the most planted varieties in Saint-Emilion before phylloxera. And then when phylloxera came, and phylloxera is a vine disease, and when this phylloxera disease spread, it you know, demolished most vineyards, many vineyards in Europe. And actually, the Bordelais decided not to replant Malbec because it didn't grow so in these dry climates. It thrives, it does really well, and it doesn't have the same problems of poor fruit set that it does in France. Argentina's Malbec also went through its own kind of peaks and troughs, but at the moment it's very much at a peak, and there are over 44,000 hectares, so enormously widely planted around Argentina, but very much focused in Mendoza. Did they get Malbec before phylloxera? Yes, they did. So 1853 is a really key date, because phylloxera came in towards the 1880s is when it really started to take a big stab at the wine production in Europe. And actually, Chile was the first to import these varieties, and then it came to Argentina a couple of years later. So both Chile and Argentina received a lot of these varieties, which were later then lost in France completely. So another example is Carmenere, which disappeared. You know, it was thought to be extinct until it was rediscovered in 1994 in Chile, and under the misnomer of Merlot. They had thousands of hectares planted and they thought it was Merlot, but it was actually Carmenere. And there's a couple interesting stories like that. And South America very much is a treasure trove of many of these old varieties that have never been, you know, have been lost elsewhere. So one thing that you'll always notice about Malbec is this incredible, intense purple color. And I hope that those who have it in the glass have that kind of vibrancy of color. And that's one dead giveaway if you're trying to work out in a blind tasting or impress your friends. It's that really beautiful kind of violet hue that you get. Typically you'll always get kind of aromas of plums, and also you can get quite attractive kind of violet notes to it. And these will all kind of change depending on where it comes from. So in the warmer regions, you'll get slightly kind of jammier, kind of more prune or plum jam notes, whereas in the much cooler, higher altitude regions, you might get more kind of fresh plums, or sometimes even notes of you know, black currants, or sometimes red berries too. So the expression of fruit with wines or grapes really changes depending on the climate within the same grape variety. Typically you'll get quite a nice kind of full body, but you have quite medium soft tannins, which is why it really succeeded in the international market, because it gives you a very kind of full and satisfactory wine, and yet it doesn't have the kind of intensity or kind of tough tannins that come with something more like a Cabernet Sauvignon. And it's grown all over Argentina. We've got so many different styles coming to the fore now. So there's quite different styles. The typical, what it used to be about 10 years ago, was very kind of warm alcohol, 14.5, 15 sometimes, and often quite a lot of oak. But in recent years, there's a tendency to use a lot less oak and to kind of focus more on the freshness. It's nice to see what some of you are tasting. So I'd love to know what wines you have in your glass. Finca Escorihuela Gascon, nice, beautiful, black currancy. That's a great kind of descriptor for Malbec there. So I'm going to look briefly at kind of three of the main wine regions of Mendoza, because they all kind of express a very different kind of style of Malbec and also have quite a different identity in terms of wineries and vines too. So the map here you have on the left shows you the main wine regions. The kind of green, blue and pink at the bottom is the Yuca Valley. The orangey color there is Luján de Cuyo, and then we've got purple Maipo. And we're going to talk about those. The kind of green is all north and eastern Mendoza, which is incredibly important in terms of large production, so more bulk wines, jug wines, but you won't see it very often on the label. The ones that you will most likely see are Maipo, Luján, and the Yuca Valley. And so here, Maipo actually is more kind of old vines territory. It was one of the most historic wine regions. And actually where you see where Mendoza city is and you see Maipo's proximity to that, that's why it developed as such an important wine region, was because it was right there on the city door and you had your market right there kind of willing and coming to your winery and picking up the wine as they did then. They would come with their damejuanas, their bottles and fill it straight from the barrel. And then Luján also developed because it's just to the south, and those are both kind of important historical regions. In terms of quality now, we're really looking at Luján and the Yuca Valley as kind of the two leaders of top quality Malbec. So Luján de Cuyo, some of the ones that you're tasting here, so if you've got the Nieto Cenetiner, I think that will probably be from their Luján vineyard. Luigi Bosca's Vestalba will also be from Luján. Famatina is all the way kind of up in the north again, so that's nice and interesting. La Mascota's Maipo normally. So Luján is a beautiful wine region, and it kind of extends from the south of Mendoza down to the Yuca Valley, and you've always got this incredible mountain view with it, with every vineyard kind of in the distance. And the closer you get to the mountains, the cooler it typically is as well, which is where you get a bit more of that kind of floral note versus the kind of more plummy, jammy notes in the more lower lying sections. And what I love about Luján is the old vines, because you get some vines of Malbec that are over 100 years, and the older the vine, the more concentrated the fruit it gives you. So they, rather than, you know, producing 10 bunches of Malbec grapes, they might just produce 2 or 3. And all of that means you've got much more concentrated wine in the end. The Yuca Valley is the kind of new frontier, but it's not that new. It's also a historical wine region, but it's really, we call it the new frontier because it's really boomed in the last 15 years. This kind of enormous growth spurt started in the kind of early 2000s. And has kind of plateaued in the last 3 years, but it's still one of the most important wine regions to keep your eye on. And just stunning, I'm sure many of you have been, and it's absolutely one of the most spectacular wine regions in the world, without doubt, because you do have the Andes in close proximity with you all the time, which, as we've discussed, is what kind of is really important for the quality there. So I don't know if anyone's got, okay, great. So you've got a La Consulta Malbec, which is excellent. La Consulta is a really nice region in the far south, and produces really nice, like I typically think of it as producing quite nice kind of floral style of Malbecs. Super. So I wanted to also kind of touch on, well, I'd love to hear your thoughts about Malbec pairing and what you might kind of be tasting your Malbec with. But the kind of typical for Malbec is obviously a big, juicy steak. But with some of these lighter, more modern styles with less oak, I think you can also do nice things with kind of roast vegetable salads or slightly kind of fatty fish, maybe salmon or something, which because it doesn't have very present tannins. So you can really kind of play around a lot more with your pairings. Before we finish, I wanted to kind of touch on some of the new frontiers of Argentine winemaking. And those are the regions that I hadn't yet mentioned from the map. So next to Rio Negro is Nuken, and that only started being planted really since the early 2000s. And it kind of has boomed to become quite an important wine region. Nuken's a great wine region to visit because if you're into kind of dinosaur fossils, there's plenty to discover. There's a great winery there called Schroeder, where they actually, when they were excavating for the wine cellar, they discovered a big dinosaur fossil, which is why they've got a wine named Saurus. And Rio Negro is a beautiful historic wine region to visit, but with some excellent wines today, a much earthier style of Malbec, but also very kind of balanced and elegant. And then further south in Chubut, we've actually got some of the we've got the southernmost commercial vineyard in the world, which is that teeny tiny number 9 that you can see on the map. And that's just on Sarmiento Lake. And it's further south than anywhere from New Zealand or Central Otago, and they're making some incredible Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. And this Chubut region is very much cool climate. So, you know, this vineyard here with the snow is the one that I'm talking about. And so we're looking at a totally different face for Argentine wine, which I think makes it really interesting and exciting. And then this picture with the, are they nandus? I'm terrible with birds, but this picture is from Bahia Bustamante, which is another new wine region, a teeny tiny vineyard that's emerged there, and literally the vines are kind of lapped up by the sea every day. And we have a couple new ones. Jujuy has really developed in recent years up in the north as well, growing a lot more. And then we've got some just outside of Buenos Aires, also coastal vineyards, which again is a very new phenomena for Argentine wine, whereas Chile and Uruguay have always been very coastal. You know, these are the first coastal vineyards that we're really seeing in Argentina. Perfect. That's me at the end of my presentation. I'm so sorry about the terrible truck, which is pumping something outside. I still don't really understand what's happening, but I apologize. But if anyone had any questions or about any wines from South America, I'm more than happy to kind of talk about anything else, or about the wines that you're tasting, then I'd love to know your impressions.
Amanda, before you look at the chat, I had a couple of questions by email before, so to save them, typing them all in again, I'll just ask you if I can. Amanda asked about Malbec. She said for someone, not you Amanda, another Amanda,
Okay.
for someone who doesn't eat meat, what would you recommend serving alongside a glass of Malbec?
Well, I would definitely go with some of the lighter kind of fresher styles from the Yuca Valley. And I would certainly think about, again, like fatty fish, so kind of salmon or even meatier fish like tuna would be great. And then if you're looking at kind of just focusing on vegan or vegetable alternatives, then kind of grilled vegetables work really nicely. That kind of slightly charred note works really well with Malbec as well. And I've always loved it with grilled aubergine is one of my favorite things for Malbec. So that's a nice one to do. And then empanadas can be a really great thing to make with Malbec. Obviously meat empanadas are the most famous, but you can put anything in an empanada, and like nice interesting kind of flavors to work with Malbec is rosemary, and some kind of, you know, make some nice kind of plum compote or something to work with it.
Brilliant. And then Amanda asked two questions, very keen here. A slightly more technical one. What percentage of the wines produced in Argentina are exported to the UK? I know they drink most of them themselves. And how does this compare with the volume from Chile? Yeah, so what's interesting about the difference between Chile and Argentina is that Chile really exports most of its wine production, over 85%, I believe. And Argentina consumes about 60% of their own. I haven't got the figures for the last 2 years because they haven't been announced yet. But at least 2 years ago, you know, the majority, or 60%, was consumed within Argentina and 40% exported. The most important market for Argentina is the US, obviously because of size, and you know, the UK, we import a lot of wines from all over the world. But the main difference, I think that's one of the key differences between Argentina and Chile, is this cultural difference in that Argentinians do drink a lot of wine.
whereas Chile sadly don't. I mean, in Argentina's heyday in the 70s, they were drinking over 90 litres per capita, and actually Buenos Aires is still the second city after Paris with the highest consumption per capita. So it is, it is a wine country, and I think that really comes through in their passion and the production of wines as well, because they drink it themselves. So it's not just about a business, it's very much a lifestyle and a heritage.
Yeah, absolutely. And that went with the average 1 kilo of meat they were eating a day, didn't it? So
yeah, absolutely. They eat quite a lot.
Yeah. And then Philip's asked a really interesting question. He picked up on a point you made right at the beginning about most vineyards in the Mendoza region being irrigated by the Andes, effectively, snows and glaciers. How significant is the threat of global warming to the future of these vineyards?
Really significant. However, global warming has many poses many challenges. Water is one. Even though you're getting a higher rainfall now, but you're getting less snow. And actually, what they need is the snow melt in order to kind of keep the water. They're getting more summer rains, which is not convenient. So that is a challenge. And I think the kind of impact that we're seeing is that we're losing a lot of those cheaper bulk wine productions because it's not viable to use water for that. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because there's still this kind of hangover from Argentina's big wine production heyday in the 70s and 80s. And so actually now it's kind of focusing more on quality. So we're still definitely Mendoza will still always be an enormous wine producing region. They'll have plenty of water for that. But it has become incredibly important in order to start conserving water. And they've all moved, mainly, not all, that it's still in transition, moved from flood irrigation, which is where you just, let the water run through the vineyard with kind of larger channels or naturally, to drip irrigation, which is where you just literally, have a little drop above the vine, and that keeps it much more effective for water use. The other big thing we're seeing with climate change is that people are moving higher in altitude to get those cooler temperatures. So that's been a significant change in the wine regions of Argentina. And obviously those wine regions further south that I showed at the end on the map, that's been a big change for climate change. And the same way that England is producing good wine now, that's one of the kind of benefits of climate change, is that it's made it more viable in those regions.
Fascinating, thanks so much. Now I got a question here, I can see in the chat from Chris about sparkling wine, and does Argentina produce any quality sparkling? I know Brazil does now, but does Argentina?
Yes, it does. Yeah, so Chandon, Moet and Chandon, their first investment outside of France, outside of Champagne, was in Argentina. In Mendoza, and they went there looking, for a wine region that would be capable of making good quality sparkling wine. And they continue to have an outpost there, Chandon, and they've also got their Terrazas de los Andes is also their fine wine, kind of still wine arm. So you do get good sparkling wines. My favorite from Argentina is a winery called Cruzat, and they make some excellent traditional method Champenois style sparkling wines, including some that have been on the lees for 10 years and just incredible, complex, lovely stuff. Definitely look for kind of Mendoza is the main region for sparkling wine.
Great. And Simon has asked, how do you see the development of blends in Argentina? He says his experience was not great.
Blends of which grapes?
I don't know.
There are so many blends. Blends are really important in all regions. Blends, historically, that's what you used to do, or didn't have the kind of viticulture ability to make a really balanced wine, one grape variety. So you would have field blends, often with white grapes and red grapes planted together in a whole bunch of different varieties with different properties, so that you could kind of create a wine. So many of the historical wine regions in Chile and Argentina, for example, are still planted as field blends. So you'd have one plant of Malbec, one plant of Semillon, one plant of Bonarda, and between them all together, you would hope to get a really nice, round, bright, juicy wine. So blends are still really important. And I have tried some excellent blends. from Argentina. There are some great white blends. There's a new movement in white blends, often using Torrontés, which gives it a very Argentine feel, with Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc, which gives it more structure and acidity. And there's some really nice red blends too. The kind of typical Bordeaux varieties do very well in nice blends from Luján de Cuyo in particular. But the kind of boom of monovarietal Malbec in the early 2000s is obviously what put Argentina on the map. However, I would probably say secretly that most of the Malbecs that you are drinking will probably have 5% Bonarda or something in there. Because that's within the EU regulation, you're allowed up to 15% of any other varieties, and no one needs to put on the label. There's a lot that you will, there's a lot of blending going on, and even if it's all Malbec, it might be Malbec from different regions. So blending is an integral part of winemaking today, as it always has been. And yes, Sophie, Crusat is the one that I mentioned.
Okay, brilliant. Excellent.
Liver disease, I have no idea.
Well, look, Amanda, I don't want to encroach upon your time anymore. I think we've had such a fascinating session. We could go on and on all evening, couldn't we? But I think the one thing you didn't tell us anything about was your last slide that I saw and you didn't show anyone, was about your book. So I just put the link to your book in the chat, but maybe you could just tell us really quick, because I saw it at the last meeting where you had a little preview, and your attention to detail was incredible. And as I said to you yesterday, I'm definitely going to be buying your first copy.
Yeah, so my book is on for sale on the website at the moment. The copies are arriving from the printer on Friday, so I'll be sending them out as of next week. It is enormous. It is 528 pages, all in color, like 40 maps, which has been really hard to develop and taken 2 years of development, and very much speaking to winemakers in every single vineyard to get them to mark their vineyards. It's been a real labor of love. And I hope that it will be something that really helps people to access and appreciate South American wine a lot more. It's not just Argentina and Chile, but also Uruguay, Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, and covering some really off the beaten track regions and interesting stories, as well as the kind of famous ones that you really should be getting your teeth into. So check out my website, it's South America Wine Guide, and get in touch if you have any questions, or if I can help you source some great wines for your next asado or barbecue.
Great, Amanda, thanks so much. I would just like to thank you on behalf of everyone. It's been absolutely fascinating. And everyone, please unmute yourselves and show your appreciation. We'll raise a glass, even better.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you.